The halls of Street Claire's trauma center were reserved for the elite Ivy League doctors and nurses with egos as polished as their credentials. When Alara Voss walked in wearing scrubs that looked 2 sizes too big and a silence that made the room hold its breath, they didn't just ignore her. They laughed. They called her the ghost, the has-been, and the walking liability. They tried to break her spirit, but they didn't know who she really was. They didn't know that the scars on her forearms weren't from accidents, but from shrapnel that had torn through her flesh in places the maps didn't name. They didn't know that their most critical patient, a dying Navy SEAL commander, was clinging to life for one reason only, and it wasn't for the doctors with their Instagram followers and their surgical theater egos. The mockery in the break room of Ward 4 West wasn't subtle. It was the cutting, deliberate kind that was meant to carry through the thin walls and lodge itself in your spine. I asked her for a retractor and she handed me forceps. Dr. Lucien Crowell said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. He was the golden child of Street. Jude's a trauma surgeon whose social media presence rivaled his actual surgical precision. I swear, HR must be recruiting from homeless shelters now. She looks like she wandered off a Greyhound bus. She's 45 if she's a day, his sister Nora chimed in. Surgical nurse and chief enabler of her brother's cruelty. She stirred her overpriced oat milk latte with manicured fingers. Who starts a nursing career at 45? And those hands, have you seen them shake? I watched her trembling when she was setting up the central line kit for Mr. Kapoor. Probably DTs. Alcoholic or burnout, Dr. Miles Ketter added, the eager resident who'd learned early that climbing the ladder meant stepping on the people below you. Either way, she's a malpractice suit waiting to happen. Get her out of my OR before she kills someone. Crowell checked his Rolex. If she so much as breathes near a patient during a critical procedure, I'm filing a formal complaint with Sterling. We can't have incompetence dragging down our trauma metrics. Outside the door, Alara Voss adjusted the collar of her scrub top. It was teal standard issue, but on her it hung like borrowed clothes on a body that had been carved down to essentials by years of carrying wounded men through firefights. She had heard every word, every syllable of contempt, every laugh at her expense. She didn't blink. She didn't storm in to defend herself. She simply picked up the tray of sterilized instruments she'd been carrying and walked toward the nurse's station, her footsteps making no sound on the linoleum. Alara had been at Street Jude's for 3 weeks. In that time, she had spoken fewer than 100 words. She did the grunt work, changing bedpans, sanitizing surfaces, restocking crash carts, the tasks that the younger, credentialed nurses considered beneath their degrees. She took the graveyard shifts nobody wanted. She took the ridicule. She took it all in silence. Hey, newbie. Alara paused. It was Dr. Ketter, the second-year resident with a smirk that seemed surgically attached to his face. He tossed a coffee-stained lab coat at her. It hit her shoulder and slid down. Take that to laundry and grab me a coffee. Black, 2 sugars. And try not to screw it up like you did yesterday's discharge paperwork. Alara slowly peeled the coat off her shoulder. She looked at Ketter. For a split second, her eyes, usually a dull, passive gray-blue, flashed with something cold and metallic. It was the look of someone who had decided whether men lived or died in the fraction of time it takes a heart to beat. Someone who had made those decisions in the dark, under fire, with no time for second-guessing. Ketter's smirk faltered. Just for a fraction of a second. Coffee, Alara said softly. Her voice was like gravel being dragged across velvet, rough, worn, but carrying an edge that made you listen. Yeah, coffee, Ketter stammered, his confidence returning as she turned away. Freak. The truth was, Alara's hands did shake, but not from alcohol, not from age. They shook from the phantom vibrations of Black Hawk rotors that still hummed in her bones. They shook because for 20 years, her hands had been covered in the blood of boys, some barely old enough to shave, who cried out for their mothers in the red dust of Kandahar, the shattered streets of Fallujah, and places so classified the government would deny they existed even under oath. She wasn't just a new nurse. She was former Lieutenant Alara Voss, call sign Sentinel, a specialized pararescue jumper and combat medic attached to Tier 1 Special Operations units, the only woman to ever complete the PJ pipeline and deploy with the teams off the books. 400 combat saves, 16 years in the shadows, a body held together with titanium rods and surgical mesh. She had retired 3 years ago after an IED turned her convoy into a fireball and left her with a traumatic brain injury, a spine full of metal, and a left hip that ached before every rainstorm like a barometer made of bone. She had come to Street Jude's not for the paycheck, God knows the pay was insulting, but because she needed the noise. The silence of retirement was too loud. It amplified the ghosts. She needed the beeping of monitors to drown out the screaming in her memories. She needed the fluorescent lights to chase away the darkness that followed her home from war. She needed to feel useful, to feel like her hands could still save instead of just shake. But she had promised herself. No heroics, no combat, just quiet care. She was failing spectacularly at the quiet part, mostly because Dr. Lucien Crowell and his circle of surgical sociopaths were making her life a living hell. That afternoon, the hospital PA system crackled to life. The tone was different, urgent, 3 sharp blasts. Code Black, Trauma Bay 1, ETA 3 minutes. Mass casualty event reported. High-value transfer incoming. The break room emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm. Dr. Crowell was already barking orders as he sprinted down the hallway, his designer scrubs somehow still looking pristine. Nora, Prep Bay 1, Keter, get the blood bank on speed dial. This is it. People, we have VIPs incoming from the military airfield. Alara stood by the linen cart in the hallway. She wasn't assigned to Trauma Bay 1. She was assigned to mop-up duty. Literally. Her job was to clean the waiting room and restock supplies while the real medical staff handled the emergencies. But as the sirens wailed closer, a sound cut through the sterile hospital air that made her blood run cold. It was the distinct, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a heavy-lift military helicopter descending onto the roof. Alara dropped the mop. She knew that sound. She knew it the way a mother knows her child's cry in a crowded room. That wasn't a civilian medevac chopper. That was a pavehawk. Something had gone wrong. Badly, catastrophically wrong. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos. The double doors burst open, and paramedics accompanied by 2 massive men in plain clothes, wearing tactical headsets, and the unmistakable bearing of operators wheeled in a stretcher. The patient was a nightmare of wires, blood-soaked gauze, and shattered bone. Male, early 40s, multiple gunshot wounds to the thoracic cavity. The lead paramedic shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and adrenaline. BP is 60/40 and dropping. We lost his pulse twice in the bird. Dr. Crowell stepped up, his ego expanding to fill the room like a toxic gas. I've got this. Clear the way. Get a line in him. Type in cross-match stat. Prep for emergency thoracotomy. The men in tactical gear hovered at the edges of the room like wolves guarding a fallen packmate. One of them, a bearded giant with a scar running down his neck like a lightning strike, grabbed Crowell's scrub sleeve in a grip that could crush bone. Doc, the man growled, his voice like grinding concrete. You listen to me real carefully. This is Commander Rafe Calder. You lose him, and there is no hole deep enough on this planet for you to hide in. Do you understand me? Crowell yanked his arm away, face flushing red. Get these men out of my OR. I am trying to save a life here. Security. Hospital security ushered the operators out, but the tension they left behind was thick enough to choke on. On the table, Commander Rafe Calder was fading. The monitor screamed a flat, dissonant tone that turned every medical professional's blood to ice. He's coding, Nora Crowell screamed, her composure finally cracking. V-fib, paddles, Crowell yelled, sweat already beading on his forehead. Charge to 200. Thump. Nothing. Charge to 300. Thump. Still nothing. Come on. Come on. Crowell was sweating now, the confident surgeon starting to crack under pressure. The damage was too extensive. Arterial spray was hitting the floor with every compression, painting the white tile red. Where's the bleeder? I can't see anything through this mess. In the corner of the room, unnoticed in the chaos, Alara Voss had slipped in. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be in the waiting room, with a mop and a bottle of industrial cleaner, but she was watching the monitor, watching the blood flow, watching the pattern of the bleeding, and she saw what Dr. Lucien Crowell, with his Instagram following and his Ivy League pedigree, had missed completely. Crowell was laser-focused on the chest wounds, the obvious, dramatic trauma. But the blood wasn't pooling in the chest cavity alone. Commander Calder's abdomen was distended, tight as a drum, swelling with internal hemorrhage. He's got a junctional hemorrhage, Alara whispered. No one heard her. I said charge to 360. Crowell screamed, his voice reaching a pitch of desperation. We're losing him. Elara moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was muscle memory. 20 years of combat medicine taking over her civilian body like a possession. She stepped past Dr. Ketter, who tried to block her path. Get out of here, janitor, Ketter hissed. Elara shoved him. It wasn't a gentle push. She drove her shoulder into his sternum with enough force to knock the breath out of his lungs and send him stumbling backward into a crash cart. Hey! Crowell looked up, eyes wide with rage and disbelief. What the hell are you doing? Security! Elara ignored him completely. She reached the table. She didn't look at Crowell. She looked at the wound on Commander Calder's upper thigh, high up near the groin, hidden beneath shredded tactical pants and overlooked in the chaos. It was a femoral artery nick bleeding internally, disguised by the more dramatic chest trauma. He's bleeding out from the femoral, Elara said, her voice dropping an octave into her command voice, the voice that had directed fire teams under mortar attack, the voice that had cut through helicopter rotors and gunfire, and the screams of the dying. Stop compressions. You're pumping the blood out of him. You're fired, Crowell roared. Get away from my patient. Elara didn't flinch. She jammed her fist literally, her entire gloved fist deep into the open wound on Commander Calder's groin. It was a brutal, archaic combat medic maneuver that looked more like an assault than medicine. The room went silent except for the hiss of the ventilator. I said. Elara repeated, staring Crowell dead in the eyes without blinking. Stop compressions. Look at the monitor. Crowell looked. The blood pressure, which had been flatlining in a long, damning horizontal line, gave a small, weak blip. Then another. Then a third. The massive arterial spray that had been coating the floor slowed to a trickle. By applying direct manual pressure to the femoral artery against the pelvic bone, Elara had crimped the hose, cut off the leak, bought them time. He's stabilized, Nora whispered, staring at the screen like she was witnessing a miracle. Elara didn't smile. She was sweating, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly from the physical exertion, but her grip inside the wound was iron. Clamp, Elara said. She didn't ask. She ordered. Dr. Crowell stood frozen, his brain struggling to process what was happening. The janitor nurse, the one he'd mocked for trembling hands, was currently elbow-deep in a Navy SEAL commander, holding his life together with sheer brute force and 20 years of battlefield experience. I said. Elara barked, her voice cutting through his shock like a scalpel. Give me a damn vascular clamp, doctor. Crowell snapped out of it. He grabbed the instrument with shaking hands and held it out to her. With a dexterity that belied her earlier trembling, Elara navigated the blood-slicked cavity, found the torn femoral artery, and clamped it blind by feel alone, the way she'd done 100 times in the back of moving vehicles with no light and incoming fire. She slowly withdrew her hand. The monitor held steady. Now, Elara said, peeling off her blood-soaked gloves and tossing them into the biohazard bin. You can treat the chest wounds. He won't bleed out while you do it. She turned to walk away, her limp more pronounced now from the strain. Wait, Crowell stammered, his voice small for the first time. Who are you? Elara paused at the door. The adrenaline was already fading, and the familiar ache in her titanium spine was returning with a vengeance. She looked at the floor. Just the new nurse, she said quietly. She walked out, but as she left, the doors to the trauma bay swung open again. The two operators from before the ones security had kicked out were standing there. They had watched the last 30 seconds through the observation glass. The bearded giant, Briggs, stared at Elara as she walked past. His eyes went wide with recognition. He looked at her face, then at the way she walked, favoring her left leg slightly, the distinctive gait of someone with a prosthetic hip joint. Sentinel, Briggs whispered. Before we continue with what happens next, if you're following Elara's journey, let us know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and tell us. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever met someone whose quiet strength changed everything? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is just getting started, and what happens next will leave you speechless. We share stories about the invisible heroes among us, the veterans who walk beside us carrying burdens we can't see, and the moments when true strength reveals itself. Comment Valkyrie below if you believe we should never judge people by their appearance. Elara didn't stop. She didn't acknowledge him. She kept walking until she reached the staff locker room, where she sat on a cold metal bench and buried her face in her hands. She had broken cover. She had broken protocol. And she had definitely just gotten herself fired. Inside the trauma bay, Commander Calder's vitals were stabilizing, but the drama was far from over. Dr. Kral was already spinning the narrative in his head. I saved him. I directed the nurse. It was my team. My leadership. He had no idea that the man on the table was waking up. And he certainly had no idea that Commander Rafe Calder owed Alara Voss a debt that couldn't be paid with money, a debt written in blood and fire 3 years ago in a valley that didn't exist on any map. 3 weeks. That's how long Alara Voss had been invisible at Street Claire's trauma center. 21 days of existing in the spaces between people's notice, moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors like a ghost no one wanted to acknowledge. She was the nurse who restocked the crash carts at 3 a.m. when the rest of the staff was sleeping, the one who changed bedpans without complaint, while the younger nurses, fresh out of their accelerated programs with their pristine credentials, stood in clusters discussing their weekend plans and their student loan repayment strategies. She was furniture, wallpaper, the kind of person you looked through rather than at. The break room of Ward 4 West was never truly private. The walls were thin enough that you could hear conversations bleeding through like confessions you weren't meant to witness. Alara stood just outside the door, her arms loaded with a tray of sterilized instruments that needed to be returned to the supply room. She should have kept walking, should have pretended not to hear, but she heard everything. I asked her for a clamp, and she handed me a hemostat. Dr. Lucien Crowell's voice carried that particular tone of amused contempt that came so easily to men who'd never been told no. I mean, honestly, where did HR find this woman? She looks like she wandered in from a bus stop. Nora Crowell, his sister, his enabler, his partner in casual cruelty, laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had sharp edges. She's what, 45? Who starts a nursing career at 45? And those hands. Miles, you've seen them shake, right? Like she's got the DTs, Dr. Miles Ketter added, and Alara could picture him leaning forward, eager to contribute to the pylon. Probably an alcoholic, or maybe just burned out from whatever nursing home she worked at before this. Either way, she's a liability. Get her out of my OR, Lucien. I'm serious. One mistake during a critical procedure, and we're all looking at malpractice. Don't worry, Crowell said, and Alara heard the sound of him checking his watch, that expensive Rolex he wore like a badge of superiority. She won't last another week. I'm documenting everything, every tremor, every hesitation. Sterling will have her out before the month is over. Alara stood there, the metal tray cool against her forearms. She didn't blink, didn't let her hands shake, though they wanted to, didn't storm through the door to defend herself or explain or beg them to see her as human. She simply adjusted her grip on the tray and continued walking toward the nurse's station. She had been here before. Not at Street Jude's specifically, but in this moment. The moment when people decided you were less than them. When they looked at your surface and made judgments about your worth. She'd survived worse than words. She'd survived things that would break Lucien Crowell into pieces so small you'd need a microscope to find them. Hey, newbie. Alara stopped. Dr. Ketter stood in the hallway, his lab coat stained with coffee and what looked like mustard. He held it out at arm's length, like it was contaminated. Take this to laundry, he said, not asked. And grab me a coffee from the lounge. Black, 2 sugars. Try not to mess it up like you did the discharge charts yesterday. He tossed the coat at her. It hit her shoulder and slid down her arm. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, Alara looked at him. Really looked at him. Her eyes, usually a dull, passive gray blue that people overlooked, flashed with something cold and metallic. It was the look of someone who had made life and death decisions in the span of a heartbeat. Someone who had held a man's beating heart in her hands while bullets tore through the air around her. Someone who knew exactly how fragile the human body was, and exactly where to apply pressure to save it, or end it. Ketter's smirk faltered. Just for a moment. Coffee, Alara said quietly, her voice like gravel being dragged across silk. Black. 2 sugars. Yeah, Ketter said, his confidence returning as she bent to pick up the lab coat. And don't take all day. Alara walked away, the coat draped over one arm, the tray of instruments balanced on the other. Behind her, she heard Ketter mutter a single word. Freak. She didn't react. She just kept walking, her footsteps silent on the linoleum, counting down the hours until her shift ended and she could go home to her empty apartment and the silence that was somehow louder than all the noise in the world. 3 weeks down, she wondered how many more she could endure before something inside her finally broke. The truth was, Alara's hands did shake, but not from alcohol, not from age or incompetence or any of the things. Dr. Lucien Crowell whispered about her in break rooms and hallway consultations. They shook from the phantom vibrations of Black Hawk rotors that still hummed in her bones 3 years after she'd taken her last flight. They shook because for 20 years, her hands had been covered in the blood of boys, some barely old enough to vote who cried out for their mothers in the red dust of Kandahar, the shattered streets of Fallujah, and places so classified that the government would deny their existence even under congressional subpoena. She wasn't just a new nurse struggling to find her footing in a civilian hospital. She was former Lieutenant Alara Voss, callsign Sentinel, a specialized pararescue jumper and combat medic attached to Tier 1 Special Operations units. The only woman to ever complete the PJ pipeline and deploy with the teams off the books. 400 combat saves across 16 years in the shadows. 16 years of being dropped into hell with a medkit and a mission. Keep them alive long enough to get home. She had performed emergency thoracotomies in the back of moving vehicles, while rounds pinged off the armor plating. She had intubated dying men by feel alone in pitch-black compounds with no electricity. She had held pressure on severed arteries with one hand while returning fire with the other, because in that world, you didn't get the luxury of choosing between medic and soldier. You were both, or you were dead. The IED had found her convoy on a Tuesday. She remembered that detail with crystal clarity. Tuesday, 1,347 hours. Route red outside a village that didn't have a name on any map. The blast had turned their lead vehicle into a fireball and sent hers tumbling end over end like a child's toy. When she woke up, she was pinned under twisted metal, her spine screaming, her ears ringing so loud she couldn't hear the gunfire she could see tearing through the smoke around her. Half her team didn't make it out. The half that did owed their lives to the fact that even with a traumatic brain injury and 3 fractured vertebrae, Alara had dragged them to cover one by one and held their wounds closed until the QRF arrived. They gave her a medical discharge, a chest full of medals she kept in a box she never opened, and a spine full of titanium rods that set off metal detectors and ached before rainstorms like a barometer made of bone. They didn't give her a way to live with the silence. That was the thing no one told you about leaving the military. The silence was worse than the combat. In the war, there was always noise. Helicopters, gunfire, radios crackling with coordinates and casualty reports. The beeping of monitors keeping someone alive. The sound of your own heartbeat in your ears when you were doing chest compressions on a teammate and praying to a god you weren't sure you believed in anymore. But retirement? Retirement was silent. Silent enough to hear the ghosts. Alara had tried. She'd tried therapy and medication and volunteering at the VA, and all the things they tell you to do when you come home and discover that home doesn't fit anymore. Nothing worked. Nothing quieted the screaming in her head, except the beeping of hospital monitors, and the fluorescent hum of medical equipment, and the controlled chaos of an ER at 3 a.m. So she'd come to St. Jude's. Not for the money. The pay was insulting compared to what private military contractors had offered her. She'd come because she needed the noise, because she needed to feel useful again, because she needed to believe that her hands could still save lives instead of just shake with the weight of all the ones she couldn't. She'd promised herself it would be different this time. No heroics, no combat, just quiet care, just helping people heal in a world where the biggest emergency was a code blue, not a firefight. She was failing spectacularly, mostly because Dr. Lucien Crowell and his circle of surgical sociopaths seemed determined to make her life hell. Every day was a new humiliation. Every shift was a reminder that in this world, credentials mattered more than competence. That a man with an Instagram following and an Ivy League degree would always be believed over a woman with scars she couldn't explain and hands that shook from battles she wasn't allowed to talk about. But Alara endured. She'd survived worse than words. At least, that's what she told herself every morning when she put on those 2 big scrubs and walked back into Street Claire's trauma center. Every morning, until the morning Commander Rafe Calder arrived dying on a stretcher. And everything changed. The hospital PA system crackled to life at 1,423 hours. Alara noticed the time because she'd been checking the clock every 15 minutes, counting down the hours until her shift ended and she could escape back to her apartment and the blessed numbness of exhaustion. But the tone that came through the speakers was different. Urgent. The kind of urgent that made every medical professional within earshot stop what they were doing and listen. 3 sharp blasts, then, Code Black, Trauma Bay 1, ETA 3 minutes, mass casualty event reported, high-value transfer incoming. The break room emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm. Dr. Crowell was already moving, his designer scrubs somehow looking crisp, even as he sprinted down the hallway, barking orders like a general commanding troops. Nora, Prep Bay 1, Keter, get the blood bank on standby. This is it. People, we have VIPs incoming from the military airfield. I want every hand on deck. Alara stood by the linen cart in the west corridor, her hands full of freshly sanitized bedding. She wasn't assigned to Trauma Bay 1. She was assigned to restock supplies and clean the staff lounge grunt work that kept her far away from anything that mattered. From anything where her shaking hands might become a liability in Dr. Crowell's perfectly orchestrated surgical theater. But then she heard it, a sound that cut through the sterile hospital air like a blade, making her blood run cold and her spine go rigid. The distinct, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a heavy-lift military helicopter descending onto the hospital roof. Alara dropped the mop she'd been holding. It clattered against the linoleum, the sound swallowed by the growing roar of rotors. She knew that sound. She knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, the way you know the voice of someone you love even in a crowded room. That wasn't a civilian medevac chopper with its high-pitched whine and careful approach. That was a Pave Hawk. Special operations. The kind of bird that only flew when something had gone catastrophically, irrevocably wrong. Alara's feet were moving before her brain caught up, carrying her toward Trauma Bay 1 even though she had no business being there, even though she'd promised herself. No heroics, no combat, just quiet care. But old instincts don't die. They just wait. The Trauma Bay doors exploded open with a crash that made nurses jump. Paramedics rushed in, their faces grim, accompanied by 2 massive men in plain clothes who moved with the unmistakable bearing of operators, tactical headsets, concealed sidearms barely hidden under civilian jackets. Eyes that swept the room with threat assessment precision, cataloging exits and potential hostiles. They wheeled in a stretcher, and Alara's breath caught. The patient was a nightmare of wires and blood-soaked gauze, his tactical pants shredded, his plate carrier cut away to reveal a chest that was more wound than skin. Multiple gunshot wounds, massive trauma, the kind of injuries you saw in war zones, not civilian hospitals. Male, early 40s, multiple GSWs to thoracic cavity. The lead paramedic shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and barely controlled panic. BP, 60/40 and dropping. We lost his pulse twice in the bird. He's circling the drain. Dr. Crowell stepped forward, his chest puffing out as he assumed command. I've got this. Clear the way. Get 2 large-bore IVs in him now. Type and cross-match for 8 units. Prep for emergency thoracotomy. Move, people. The bearded operator, massive, scarred, dangerous, grabbed Crowell's scrub sleeve in a grip that made the surgeon wince. His voice was low, controlled, but carrying the kind of threat that didn't need volume. Doc, he growled, leaning in close enough that Alara could see the tattoo on his neck, a trident, partially obscured by scar tissue. You listen to me real carefully. This is Commander Rafe Calder. You lose him, and there is no hole deep enough on this planet for you to hide in. Do you understand me? Crowell yanked his arm away, his face flushing red with indignation. Get these men out of my OR. I am trying to save a life here. Security. Hospital security, 2 overweight guards with radios hesitantly approached the operators, who ignored them completely, their eyes fixed on the man dying on the table. Finally, reluctantly, they allowed themselves to be ushered toward the observation area, but the tension they left behind was thick enough to choke on. On the table, Commander Rafe Calder was fading fast, and in the corner of the room, hidden behind a supply cart, Alara Voss stood frozen, because she knew that face. Even covered in blood and barely conscious, she knew it. She'd saved his life once before, 3 years ago, in a valley that didn't exist on any map, and now she was going to have to do it again. Dr. Crowell took command of the trauma bay with the confidence of a man who'd never truly failed at anything that mattered. He positioned himself at the head of the table, calling out orders in rapid succession, his hands moving over Commander Calder's chest wounds with practiced precision. But Alara could see what he couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. He was panicking. The monitor screamed. That flat, dissonant tone that every medical professional learns to fear. He's coding! Nora Crowell shrieked, her composure finally shattering. VFib! Paddles! Crowell yelled, his voice pitching higher. Charge to 200. The defibrillator whined. Thump! Calder's body jerked on the table. Nothing. The flatline continued its damning song. 300. Thump. Still nothing. Come on! Come on! Crowell's forehead was beaded with sweat now, his surgical confidence cracking like ice under pressure. Charge to 360. Thump. The monitor didn't change. And with every chest compression the trauma team performed, arterial spray hit the floor in rhythmic spurts, painting the white tile red. Where's the bleeder? Crowell screamed, his hands buried in the chest cavity, searching frantically. I can't see anything through this mess, but he was looking in the wrong place. Alara saw it from her position behind the supply cart. Crowell was fixated on the obvious trauma, the dramatic chest wounds that looked lethal and demanded attention. But Commander Calder's abdomen was distended, swollen tight as a drum, filling with blood from an internal hemorrhage that no one else had noticed. Junctional hemorrhage. Femoral artery bleed hidden by the shredded tactical pants and overshadowed by the chest trauma. He's got a junctional hemorrhage, Alara whispered. No one heard her. The room was too loud with panic and the screaming monitor and Crowell's increasingly desperate orders. Alara moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was muscle memory taking over 20 years of combat medicine, overriding 3 weeks of forced invisibility. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. She stepped out from behind the cart and pushed past a shocked resident. Dr. Ketter saw her coming and moved to block her path, his face twisted with outrage. Get out of here, janitor! Alara drove her shoulder into his sternum, with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs and send him stumbling backward into a crash cart. Instruments clattered to the floor. Hey! Crowell looked up, his eyes wide with rage and disbelief. What the hell are you doing? Security! Alara ignored him completely. She reached the table, her eyes locked on the wound high on Calder's thigh, partially hidden by blood-soaked fabric. Without hesitation, without asking permission, she jammed her entire gloved fist deep into the open wound at his groin. It was brutal, archaic, the kind of battlefield medicine that looked more like an assault than treatment. The room went silent except for the hiss of the ventilator. Stop compressions, Alara said, her voice dropping into that command tone she'd sworn she'd never use again. She stared Crowell dead in the eyes. You're pumping the blood out of him. Look at the monitor. You're fired. Crowell started, but his eyes flicked to the screen. The blood pressure, which had been flatlining, gave a small, weak blip, then another, then a third. The massive arterial spray that had been coating the floor slowed to a trickle, then stopped. By applying direct manual pressure to the femoral artery against the pelvic bone, Alara had crimped the vessel, cut off the leak, bought them time. He's stabilized, Nora whispered, staring at the monitor like she was witnessing a miracle. Alara didn't smile. Her face was pale, her arm shaking slightly from the physical strain, but her grip inside the wound was iron. She'd done this before dozens of times in the backs of vehicles and in dirt floor compounds with no light and incoming fire. Clamp, she said. Not a request, an order. Crowell stood frozen, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. The janitor nurse with the shaking hands was elbow deep in a Navy SEAL commander, holding his life together with sheer brute force. I said. Alara's voice cut through his shock like a scalpel. Give me a damn vascular clamp, doctor. Crowell's hand moved automatically, grabbing the instrument and holding it out. With a dexterity that made her earlier trembling seem impossible, Alara navigated the blood-slicked cavity by feel alone. She found the torn femoral artery and clamped it blind the way she'd been trained to do in total darkness. She slowly withdrew her hand. The monitor held steady. Now, Alara said quietly, peeling off her blood-soaked gloves and dropping them in the biohazard bin. You can treat the chest wounds. He won't bleed out while you do it. She turned toward the door, her limp more pronounced now, exhaustion and old injuries catching up to adrenaline. In the observation window, Briggs stood with his hands pressed against the glass. He'd watched the entire thing, watched the way she moved, the left-handed technique, the distinctive way she favored her left leg. His eyes went wide with recognition. Sentinel, he whispered, and Alara Voss kept walking, knowing her quiet civilian life had just ended. Dr. Lucien Crowell stormed into Administrator Marcus Sterling's office 47 minutes after Commander Calder's vitals stabilized. He'd taken the time to change into fresh scrubs, to compose his face into the appropriate expression of concerned authority, to rehearse the narrative he was about to sell. Sterling looked up from his computer, his expression already weary. The man lived his life in spreadsheets and liability assessments, more concerned with the hospital's endowment fund than the patients it was supposed to serve. Lucien, I heard we had an exciting afternoon in Trauma Bay 1. Exciting isn't the word I'd use, Marcus. Crowell sat down without being invited, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man delivering grave news. We had a disaster narrowly averted. That temp nurse, the one HR brought in 3 weeks ago, she assaulted Dr. Ketter, physically shoved him into a crash cart. Then she contaminated a sterile field by shoving her unwashed hands directly into a surgical cavity. Sterling's pen stopped tapping, but the patient survived. Because of me, Crowell said without hesitation, without so much as a flicker in his eyes. I guided the team. I identified the femoral bleed and directed her where to apply pressure, while I secured the chest wounds. But Marcus, it was touch and go. It's a miracle Commander Calder didn't go septic from the contamination. She's dangerous, unhinged, and if the Navy finds out that a geriatric nurse with shaking hands manhandled a SEAL commander, he let the implication hang in the air. Sterling nodded slowly, already calculating the risk to the military contract, the potential lawsuit, the bad press. You're right. We can't afford the liability. Draft the termination papers. I'll have security escort her out before shift change. Quietly. Thank you, Marcus. I know this isn't easy, but we have to protect our standards. While Crowell spun his lies 2 floors above, Elara stood in the sterilization room with her hands submerged in scalding water. She scrubbed surgical instruments with methodical precision, watching the blood swirl down the drain, and tried not to think about the fact that she'd just thrown away the only piece she'd managed to find since leaving the service. But the memories came anyway. They always did. A dust storm in Argondab Valley, the smell of burning diesel and copper, the weight of a dying boy in her arms, 18 years old, maybe 19, calling for his mother in a language she didn't speak but understood perfectly. She'd held pressure on his wounds for 40 minutes while they waited for exfil, her hands cramping, her back screaming, and when the helicopter finally came, he was already gone. She knew how this would end. In the military, if you saved the hostage, you were a hero. In the civilian world, if you saved the patient but didn't fill out the right forms, you were a liability. Results didn't matter as much as protocol. She'd known the moment she touched Commander Calder that she was done. Up in the ICU, Commander Rafe Calder's eyes cracked open. The world was fuzzy around the edges, his body heavy with sedation, but consciousness was returning in fragments. "Boss," Briggs's voice, low and familiar. "Welcome back." Calder tried to speak, but his throat was raw from intubation. He blinked, focusing on the bearded operator standing guard at his bedside. Behind him, 3 more team members were positioned at the door and window. Tactical spacing, unit integrity. "We don't break it," Briggs said when a nurse tried to make them leave. The door opened and Dr. Crowell breezed in, his smile practiced and professional. "Commander Calder, good to see you with us. That was a close call, touch and go for a while there, but I managed to clamp the femoral just in time." "You're a lucky man." Calder frowned. His memory was fragmented flashes of white light and searing pain and the sensation of bleeding out from the inside. But he remembered a grip, not the careful, tentative probing of a surgeon afraid to cause damage. A violent, decisive intrusion that hurt like hell, but stopped the cold feeling of death spreading through his legs. And a voice, raspy, commanding, female. "There was a woman," Calder rasped. Crowell's smile didn't waver, but something tightened around his eyes. "Ah, yes, the nurses. Standard procedure. They were assisting me, of course." "No." Calder struggled to sit up, pain lancing through his chest. "Not a nurse. A soldier." Crowell laughed a light, condescending sound. "The anesthesia plays tricks on the mind, Commander. There are no soldiers on my medical staff, just highly trained doctors. Now rest." He turned to leave, but Briggs stepped into his path. 6'5", 250, built like a tank. "Doc, who was the woman with the gray eyes? The one who walked out?" Crowell scoffed. "A nobody. A temp nurse being terminated as we speak for incompetence. She won't be anywhere near the commander again. Don't worry." He walked out, feeling triumphant. Briggs turned back to the bed. Calder's eyes were open, the fog clearing, replaced by something sharp and certain. Dutch, Calder whispered. I'm here, boss. He's lying. Calder's hand gripped the bed rail. Find her. The HR office was windowless and painted the color of institutional beige that made you forget what sunlight looked like. Ilara sat across from Karen, a woman whose boredom was so profound it seemed to radiate from her pores like a perfume. Karen slid a piece of paper across the desk, with the enthusiasm of someone processing expired coupons. Miss Mitchell, Dr. Crowell has filed a formal incident report. Insubordination, physical assault on a resident, and practicing outside the scope of your nursing license. We have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Ilara looked at the paper. The word termination was printed in bold at the top. She didn't argue, didn't explain that Crowell had been freezing, that Ketter had been in the way, that Commander Calder would be dead if she'd followed protocol. Okay, she said quietly. Badge, please. Ilara unclipped the plastic ID from her scrub top and placed it on the desk. It felt lighter than it should have, like it had never really belonged to her anyway. You have 20 minutes to clear out your locker. Security will escort you to the exit. 2 security guards flanked her as she walked through the main hallway. It was shift change, the worst possible time. The corridor was packed with doctors, nurses, residents, all of them stopping mid-conversation to watch the spectacle. News traveled fast in hospitals. Everyone knew the weird mute nurse had finally snapped. Dr. Ketter stood near the nurse's station, holding an ice pack to his chest, his smirk vicious. Hope you enjoy flipping burgers, newbie. Nora Crowell shook her head with theatrical disappointment. I told everyone she wasn't cut out for this. Too unstable. Ilara kept her eyes forward. She carried a small cardboard box containing a stethoscope she'd bought herself, a spare pair of socks, and a framed photo of her dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, who'd died 2 years ago. That was it. That was her entire life at Street Jude's. She reached the lobby. The automatic doors were just ahead. Freedom. Silence. The return to the ghosts. Hold it. The shout was so loud it rattled the glass in the reception booth. Every head in the lobby turned. Down the long corridor from the elevators came Briggs and 3 other operators, moving in perfect diamond formation, the kind of tactical spacing you use to protect a VIP in hostile territory. They weren't walking. They were advancing with purpose that made doctors and visitors scramble out of their way. Briggs pointed directly at Ilara. You, don't move. The security guards put their hands on their tasers. Sir, you can't be down here. This is restricted. Briggs didn't even look at them. He just kept walking until he was standing 2 feet from Ilara, towering over her. The hallway went dead silent. Was she in trouble? Had she hurt the patient after all? Was this military police coming to arrest her? Dr. Ketter's smirk widened. Oh, this is going to be good. They're going to arrest her. Briggs looked down at Ilara, studied the scar above her eyebrow, the gray eyes, the way she stood, with her weight distributed evenly despite the limp, ready to move. Ma'am, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man his size. Commander Calder is asking for you. Ilara tightened her grip on the box. I don't work here anymore. I was just fired. Briggs's head snapped up. His eyes scanned the crowd until they locked onto Dr. Crowell, who'd come down to enjoy the show. Fired, Briggs repeated, the word heavy with menace. She nearly killed the patient, Crowell shouted from the back. She's a danger to this hospital. Officers, remove her. Briggs turned slowly toward Crowell. The other 3 operators fanned out, creating a protective perimeter around Ilara. Diamond formation. VIP protection. Nearly killed him? Briggs's voice dropped low. That man upstairs is alive because someone knew how to crimp a femoral artery without seeing it. And I know for a fact, Doctor, that it wasn't you. I saw the security footage. A gasp rippled through the lobby. That's confidential property. Crowell sputtered, his face turning red. It's evidence, Briggs corrected. And I saw a woman with a distinct limp and a left-handed clamp technique save my CO's life, while you were screaming for electricity. He turned back to Ilara, saw her looking at the floor, trying to disappear, trying to be invisible again. We checked your file, ma'am, Briggs said softly, so only she could hear. Or the file you gave HR, Sarah Mitchell, associate's degree, nursing home experience. Ilara didn't look up, but I made a call to a friend at the Pentagon, gave him your vitals and description. Briggs paused. He told me there's no Sarah Mitchell. He told me there's a Jane Doe retired from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, call sign Sentinel. the only woman to complete the PJ pipeline and serve with the teams off the books. Credited with 400 combat saves. The box slipped from Alara's hands and hit the floor with a thud. The whisper ran through the crowd like wildfire. Special tactics. 400 saves. Crowell pushed to the front. I don't care if she's Florence Nightingale. She broke protocol. She's fired. She isn't going anywhere. The voice boomed from the elevators. The crowd parted. A wheelchair was being pushed forward by a terrified nurse. In it sat Commander Rafe Calder, pale, hooked to a portable IV and monitor, looking like death barely warmed over, but sitting upright. Commander, you cannot be out of bed, Crowell shrieked. Calder ignored him. He looked across the lobby at Alara. Their eyes locked. For the first time in years, Alara felt seen, not as a janitor, not as a screw-up, as who she was. Commander Calder raised a trembling hand. Slowly, painfully, he brought it to his brow in a crisp military salute. Briggs and 3 operators snapped to attention. Crack! Their boots hit the linoleum in perfect unison. They raised their hands in sharp salute. The silence in the lobby was deafening. Lieutenant, Calder rasped, I believe you have my life in your hands again. Alara's lip trembled. A single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. She slowly straightened. The slouch vanished, shoulders squared. Chin rose. She returned the salute. Commander, she whispered. Crowell looked around wildly. This is ridiculous. This is a hospital, not a parade ground. Security. Shut up, Lucien. Administrator Sterling appeared on the balcony. Just shut up. He walked down, approached Alara. Mitchell, there's been a significant misunderstanding. Alara's voice regained its steel. No misunderstanding. She looked at Crowell. I quit. No, Calder said. You don't. He rolled forward. I have a mission for you, Sentinel. Pays better than this place. The doors burst open. A man in a black suit, flanked by state troopers. Dr. Lucien Crowell? Medical Ethics Board. We received security footage showing you falsifying records. Crowell went pale, looked at Briggs. Briggs held up his phone and winked. As Crowell was dragged away, the lobby erupted in applause. For Alara. The applause died as Commander Calder's hand shot out and grabbed Alara's wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man who'd been flatlined less than 2 hours ago. Sentinel, he whispered urgently, pulling her close enough that only she and Briggs could hear. They didn't just ambush us. They hunted us. It's Blackwell. They know I have the encryption key. They know I'm here, and they don't leave loose ends. Alara's eyes narrowed, her mind already shifting gears from the emotional whiplash of the last 10 minutes to the cold tactical calculus she'd lived in for 20 years. How long do we have? Briggs checked his watch. They hit the convoy at 1,400. They'll have tracked the medevac bird. They know we're stationary. I'd say less than 20 minutes before the first scout team breaches. Alara turned to the stunned crowd still gathered in the lobby. Her voice shifted, the rasp vanishing, replaced by pure command presence that cut through the murmuring like a blade. Listen to me. Every head snapped toward her. We are locking down this hospital. This is no longer a medical facility. It is a defensive hardpoint. Administrator Sterling stepped forward, his face red with bureaucratic outrage. You can't just... If you want to live... Alara cut him off, her voice dropping to something cold and absolute. You will do exactly what I say. She turned to Briggs. Take your team and secure the ground floor entrances. Use vending machines, desks, heavy furniture, barricade the glass doors. Nothing gets in. Briggs grinned, a feral thing, and racked the slide of his concealed sidearm with a sound that made the civilians flinch. Roger that, LT. Alara's eyes found Dr. Ketter, who was trembling near the reception desk. Ketter, take Nora and move all patients from the south wing into interior corridors, away from windows. Turn off the lights. Do it now, Nora stammered. But Dr. Crowell said. Crowell is gone, Alara snapped. I am the ranking officer on this deck. Move. They moved. Alara grabbed the handles of Calder's wheelchair and pushed him toward the elevators. We're going to 4th floor surgery. Thickest walls, limited access points, backup generators, most defensible position in the building. You've done this before, Calder said. It wasn't a question. Mosul, 16. Held a field hospital for 6 hours with 3 operators and a med student. Her voice was matter-of-fact. This is bigger, but the principle's the same. The elevator doors closed. They started ascending, and then the lights died. Total darkness for 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then the backup generators kicked in, bathing the hospital in dim red emergency lighting that turned every hallway into something from a nightmare. Click. The intercom crackled to life. But it wasn't the hospital operator's voice. It was distorted, digitized, stripped of humanity. Commander Calder, we know you're on the 4th floor. Send the encryption key down in the elevator in the next 5 minutes, and we'll leave the civilians alone. You have our word. Alara looked down at Calder. They're bluffing. They're not. Calder's voice was grim. Blackwell doesn't leave witnesses. They'll kill everyone in this hospital to cover their tracks and make it look like a terrorist attack. The elevator dinged. 4th floor. Alara wheeled Calder into the surgical wing and positioned him in Trauma Room 3, the room farthest from the elevators, with the thickest walls. Then she walked to the double doors and looked through the small reinforced window. At the far end of the hallway, the elevator dinged again. The doors opened. 4 men stepped out. Black tactical gear, gas masks, silenced submachine guns held in low-ready position. They moved with fluid, professional precision, the kind you only got from years of experience in places where mistakes meant death. Blackwell operators, Tier 1 contractors, men who'd been special forces before they decided to sell their skills to the highest bidder. Alara turned back to the nurses' station, where Dr. Ketter and Nora were huddled behind the desk, their faces pale in the red emergency lighting. Supply closet. Now, Alara said quietly. Lock the door from the inside. Don't open it, unless you hear my voice saying your full name. Do you understand? Ketter's voice cracked. What are you going to do? You don't have a gun. Alara looked down at the scalpel she'd picked up from a crash cart. Then at the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Then at the shadows stretching down the hallway like dark water, offering a dozen places to hide, to wait, to strike. She looked back at Ketter, and something in her eyes made him flinch. I'm going to triage the situation, Alara said, and then she slipped into the darkness, disappearing like a ghost. The last thing Ketter saw before he scrambled into the supply closet was the fire extinguisher no longer on the wall, and the sound of boots. Getting closer. Thump, thump, thump. Somewhere in the darkness, Sentinel was waiting. The hallway was silent except for the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of boots on linoleum. 4 Blackwell operators moved in a tight stack formation, clearing rooms with mechanical efficiency. Kick, clear move. Kick, clear move. Professional, precise, lethal. The lead operator raised his fist. The stack froze. An overturned wheelchair lay in the middle of the corridor. Too obvious. Too convenient. He whispered into his comms, check right. The second operator peeled off and opened the linen closet. Whoosh. A blast of white powder exploded into his face, dry chemical fire extinguisher rigged to the door handle with surgical tape. He gagged, blinded, clawing at his gas mask. A shadow dropped from the ceiling panels above them. Alara landed on the third man's back like a predator taking down prey. Before he could raise his weapon, she jammed a syringe into the exposed gap between his neck armor and helmet. Succinylcholine, the paralytic used for intubation. The man dropped like a stone, his muscles seizing, his weapon clattering to the floor. The team leader spun and fired blindly. Bullets chewed through drywall, but Alara was already moving, rolling under a gurney, sliding across the polished floor like a baseball player stealing home. She came up behind the blinded operator, still pawing at his eyes. One kick to the back of his knee brought him down. She snatched the MP5 from his hands. Contact rear! The leader screamed. Alara fired 2 controlled 3-round bursts. The leader took hits to his vest and stumbled backward, diving behind the nurse's station. The 4th man sprayed suppressing fire down the hallway, forcing Alara into a patient room. She's armed. Flank her. Frag out. A grenade skittered across the floor and stopped just outside her door. Alara's training took over. No time to run. She grabbed the heavy lead-lined apron hanging on the door hook, the kind used for X-ray protection, and threw it over the grenade. Then she dove behind the solid oak bed frame. Boom! The explosion shook the floor. The lead apron absorbed most of the shrapnel, but the concussion wave rattled Alara's teeth and made her ears ring. Dust and smoke filled the corridor. Move up. She's stunned. The 2 remaining operators advanced through the smoke. Ilara was dazed, her vision swimming, blood trickling from her nose. She checked the MP5 jammed from the blast. Useless. She looked around. Oxygen tank. Defibrillator. She grabbed the defibrillator paddles and hit the charge button. Whine. A black boot stepped into the room. Ilara lunged not at the man, but at his weapon. She battered the barrel aside with her left hand, screaming as the hot suppressor burned her palm. With her right hand, she slammed the defibrillator paddle against his chest, right over his heart. Clear. Zap. 360 joules surged through the operator. His body went rigid. His finger clamped down on the trigger, sending a spray of bullets into the ceiling before he collapsed, convulsing. 1 man left. Ilara grabbed the fallen Glock 19 and rolled onto her back, aiming at the door. Silence. "You're good," the leader's voice called from the hallway. "For a nurse." "I'm not a nurse," Ilara called back, her voice steady despite the pain. "I know. Sentinel. We read your file. Pity you could have worked for us." "I don't work for traitors." "Then you die." A metal canister rolled into the room. Not a frag grenade. Flashbang. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears. Bang. Even with her eyes closed, the light was blinding. Her ears screamed. Disoriented, she couldn't tell up from down. The leader stormed the room and found her on the floor. He raised his rifle to her head. "Goodbye, Sentinel." Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. He'd fired his last rounds during the chaos with his partner. He cursed and reached for his sidearm. That half-second delay was all Ilara needed. She didn't shoot. She swept his legs. He hit the ground hard, and Ilara was on top of him instantly. It became a brutal, close-quarters brawl. He was stronger, heavier. He punched her in the face, splitting her lip. She took the hit and headbutted him, her forehead smashing into his nose. He roared and grabbed her throat, squeezing. Black spots danced in her vision. She couldn't breathe. Her hand scrabbled across the floor and found cold metal trauma shears. With her last ounce of strength, she drove the shears into the weak point of his tactical vest, where the shoulder strap connected. He screamed and released her. Ilara rolled away, gasping for air, and grabbed the dropped Glock. The leader stumbled to his feet, pulling a knife. "Stay down," Ilara warned. He lunged. Bang, bang, 2 shots to the chest. The leader fell backward and crashed into a cart of sterile gauze. Silence returned to the 4th floor. Ilara sat there, panting, blood dripping from her nose and lip. Her scrub top was torn, revealing the old scars on her arms. The supply closet door cracked open. Dr. Ketter's pale face appeared. "Is it over?" Ilara spun, gun raised, then lowered it when she saw it was Ketter. He stared at the bodies of highly trained mercenaries scattered across the hallway. At the burnt mark from the grenade. At Ilara, covered in dust and blood and sheetrock. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. "Check the stairwell, Ketter," Ilara said, standing and wiping blood from her mouth. "And get me a suture kit. I think I popped a stitch." Ketter nodded frantically. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am." Ilara limped to Trauma Room 3 and pushed open the door. Commander Calder sat upright in his wheelchair, holding a scalpel in his good hand, eyes sharp despite the pain medication coursing through his system, ready to fight. He saw Ilara and relaxed fractionally. "Status? Floor secure," Ilara said, leaning heavily on the doorframe. 4 hostiles down. "But they'll send a second wave. We need to move." "We can't." Calder nodded toward the window. Ilara looked out. 3 black SUVs had pulled into the parking lot. More armed men were pouring out like ants from a disturbed nest. And from the south, a helicopter was approaching, not a civilian medevac with its bright markings and navigation lights, but a blacked-out attack chopper that looked like it had been spawned from a nightmare. "That's the extraction team," Calder said grimly. "Or the cleanup crew." Ilara pulled the tactical headset off the dead team leader and fitted it over her ears. "Briggs, what's your status?" Briggs's voice came back crackling with the sound of heavy gunfire. "Pinned down in the lobby, LT. Taking heavy heat. Can't get to you." Ilara looked at Calder. They were trapped on the 4th floor. No way down. No way out. The stairwells would be covered. The elevators were death traps. "Looks like we have to do this the hard way," Ilara said. "What's the hard way?" Ilara looked at the oxygen tanks lining the wall. Then, at the approaching helicopter, a crazy, desperate plan formed in her mind, the kind of plan you only made when all the sane options were gone. "We're going to the roof," she said. "To surrender?" Alara's eyes flashed with cold determination. No, to take their ride. The stairwell was a vertical tunnel of concrete and pain. Alara had Calder's arm draped over her shoulder, her body acting as a human crutch for his shattered frame. Every step was a battle against gravity and agony. "Leave me," Calder gritted out through clenched teeth. "You can make it to the perimeter." "Negative," Alara panted, her legs burning. "We leave together or we don't leave." They burst through the steel fire door and onto the roof. The world exploded into noise and wind. A sleek matte black MH-6 Little Bird helicopter hovered just feet above the helipad, its rotors whipping the rain into a frenzy. The downdraft was immense, tearing at Alara's scrubs like invisible hands trying to rip her off the roof. 4 men were fast roping down from the skids, the cleaners. They hit the deck with heavy thuds, weapons already raised. Alara dragged Calder behind a massive HVAC ventilation unit just as bullets sparked off the metal casing. "Ping, ping, ping. They have us pinned," Calder yelled over the rotor roar. Alara looked at the oxygen tank she'd dragged up from the 4th floor. It was a crazy gamble, a 1 in a million shot. But she was out of options. "Cover your ears," she screamed. She didn't aim at the men. She aimed at the valve of the pressurized oxygen cylinder sitting on the concrete between them and the enemy. She leveled the Glock, took a breath, and found the stillness in the chaos, that place she'd lived in for 20 years, where the world slowed down and only the shot mattered. Bang! The bullet sheared the valve clean off. The cylinder didn't just explode, it became a missile. With a shrieking hiss of escaping gas, the heavy steel tank launched itself forward with terrifying velocity. It smashed into the legs of the lead mercenary, shattering bone, then careened into the tail rotor of the hovering helicopter. Crunch! The helicopter screamed, a mechanical shriek of tearing metal. The tail rotor disintegrated. The pilot lost all directional control. The bird began to spin violently, the torque whipping it around. The pilot fought the stick, but physics was unforgiving. The helicopter slewed sideways. Its skids clipped the edge of the roof, and it crashed hard onto the helipad, rolling onto its side. The main rotors shattered, sending shrapnel flying like deadly confetti. The mercenaries were knocked flat by the impact. "Move now," Ilara roared. She hauled Calder up, and they ran not away from the crash, but toward it. The pilot was slumped over the controls, unconscious. Fuel was leaking. The engine was whining, trying to tear itself apart. Ilara yanked the pilot's door open, unbuckled him, and dragged him onto the wet concrete. She shoved Calder into the co-pilot seat. "Can you fly this thing?" Calder shouted, strapping himself in. "I'm a pararescue jumper," Ilara yelled back, jumping into the pilot's seat. "We know enough to get home." She scanned the console digital glass cockpit, military grade. Warning lights were flashing red everywhere. Rotor RPM critical. Hydraulic failure. She killed the auto throttle and engaged the manual override. Outside, the surviving mercenaries were getting to their feet, raising their rifles. Bullets shattered the windshield. Glass sprayed into the cockpit. Ilara grabbed a cyclic stick and ripped the collective up. The helicopter groaned, shuddered, and lifted. It was ugly, lurching left, scraping concrete, sparks flying, but it was airborne. Ilara kicked the pedal and swung the nose around. She didn't fly away. She dipped the nose and buzzed the mercenaries, forcing them to dive for cover. "Briggs!" she screamed into the headset. "Roof is clear. We have air transport. Get to the roof." "Negative, Sentinel." Briggs's voice came back, strained. "We're cut off. Elevators disabled. Holding the lobby, but we're out of ammo." Ilara looked at the fuel gauge. Low. She looked at Calder, who was fading again from the blood loss and exertion. She made a choice. "Hold on," Ilara said. She pushed the stick forward. The damaged helicopter dove off the side of the building. For one terrifying second, they were in free fall toward the parking lot 4 stories below. Then Ilara pulled up at the last second, leveling out 50 feet above the ground. She hovered right in front of the hospital's main glass entrance, where the battle was still raging. Inside, she could see Briggs and his team pinned behind the reception desk, with Blackwell operators advancing. The helicopter's miniguns were jammed from the crash. But Ilara had something else. "Brace!" she yelled. She spun the helicopter around, aiming the engine exhaust and the massive rotor downdraft directly at the shattered lobby doors. The force was like a hurricane. It blasted into the lobby, sending furniture, glass, and Blackwell operators flying backward. Dust and debris created a blinding storm. "Go! Go! Go!" Alara screamed into the radio. Briggs saw the opening. He grabbed his wounded teammate and they sprinted from the lobby, scrambling into the back of the hovering bird, hauling themselves onto the skids. "We're clear. Punch it!" Briggs yelled. Alara pulled the collective. The helicopter screamed one last time and surged upward, climbing into the rainy night sky. Below them, the flashing lights of police and FBI units were finally swarming the grounds. The cavalry had arrived. 10 minutes too late. If not for the nurse with the shaking hands, everyone would be dead. The private airfield in Virginia was quiet in the way that only empty places can be. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the tarmac that turned the world into something between day and night, that liminal space where everything feels possible. Alara Voss stood by the chain-link fence wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a worn leather jacket, her arm in a sling. A butterfly bandage was taped over her left eye, where a piece of helicopter glass had opened a cut that had required 6 stitches. She looked like she'd been through a war, which, technically, she had. A black government sedan pulled up, its engine purring to a stop. Briggs got out first, and Alara barely recognized him. He was clean-shaven, wearing his dress uniform with all the medals and ribbons that told the story of a career spent in places that didn't exist. He opened the back door. Commander Rafe Calder stepped out. On crutches, but standing. He wore his full-dress whites, and the gold trident of a Navy SEAL gleamed on his chest like a promise kept. He walked slowly toward Alara, each step measured but determined. "They told me you declined the medal," Calder said softly when he reached her. Alara shrugged, looking out at the runway. "I didn't do it for a medal. I just wanted to do my job." "You did a hell of a lot more than that," Calder said. "Blackwell's been dismantled. The encrypted files you secured from that helicopter took down 3 corrupt senators and half the defense board. You cleaned house, Sentinel. You saved more than just my life that night." "I'm retired, Commander," Alara said quietly. "Or I was supposed to be." Calder reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "The Navy can't officially recognize what happened at that hospital. Too many classifications. Too many questions we can't answer in public." He opened the box. "But the Brotherhood can." Inside wasn't a medal. It was a small golden angel wing pin, beautifully crafted, catching the dying light of the sun. "The guys from the squadron voted," Calder said, and there was something like pride in his voice. "You're not Sentinel anymore. Your new call sign is Valkyrie, because you choose who lives and who dies." Alara took the pin. Her hands didn't shake. She felt a lump forming in her throat that she couldn't quite swallow down. "What about the hospital?" she asked, needing to know. "Dr. Crowell?" Briggs laughed a genuine, delighted sound. "Crowell? He's facing federal charges for medical negligence and fraud." The security footage was very enlightening. Administrator Sterling resigned to pursue other opportunities. The board appointed a new chief of nursing. "Who?" Briggs grinned. "Nora Crowell. Turns out she grew a backbone that night. Told the FBI everything about her brother's patterns of misconduct. She's cleaning house." Alara smiled. A real smile this time. One that reached her eyes and made her look 10 years younger. "So," Calder said, his voice taking on a different tone, not commanding but offering. "The job offer still stands. We're putting together a new task force. Medical support for operations that need someone with your particular skill set. No red tape, no administrators, no Ivy League egos, just the mission and the team. What do you say?" Alara looked down at her hands. They were still, steady. The trembling that had haunted her for 3 years was gone. Burned away in the fire of that night, perhaps. Or maybe just given purpose again. She looked at Calder, then at Briggs. Then, at the horizon, where the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She'd come to Street Jude's looking for noise to drown out the silence. Looking for a way to be useful without being a soldier. Looking for peace. But maybe peace wasn't found in silence. Maybe it was found in accepting who you were, what you were meant to do. "When do we start?" Alara asked. Calder smiled. "Transport leaves at 0600. Welcome back, Valkyrie. Alara pinned the golden wing to her jacket, right over her heart. She was done hiding, done pretending to be less than she was, done letting people like Lucien Crowell make her feel invisible. The nurse with the shaking hands was gone. Valkyrie had returned, and somewhere, on the 4th floor of St. Jude's Trauma Center, a new nurse was restocking shelves when Dr. Miles Ketter walked in. He saw her struggling with a heavy box and didn't laugh, didn't ignore her. He stepped forward. "Here, let me help you with that, because legends change things." And the legend of the nurse who was a soldier would never leave those halls. The doctors would never laugh at a new hire again. This story isn't just about combat. It isn't just about a woman with a hidden past who saved a hospital from armed mercenaries. It's about something deeper, something that lives in the spaces between what we see and what we assume. It's about the invisible battles people fight every day. Alara Voss represents thousands of veterans who walk among us carrying skills and burdens we can't see. They're driving your Uber. They're serving your coffee. They're stocking shelves at the grocery store at 3 a.m. because the daytime is too loud, and the crowds trigger something they can't explain to people who've never lived in a war zone. They're working as nurses and janitors and security guards, taking jobs that society considers beneath them, because they need the structure, because they need to feel useful, because the silence of retirement is louder than any gunfire they ever faced, and the only thing that drowns out the ghosts is the beeping of monitors and the fluorescent hum of places where life hangs in the balance. The doctors at St. Jude's judged Alara by her silence. They saw her trembling hands and assumed alcoholism. They saw her age and assumed failure. They saw her humility and mistook it for incompetence. They looked at the surface and never thought to ask what lay beneath, never wondered why someone would take a job so far below their capabilities, never questioned why her eyes sometimes went distant and hard, never considered that the scars on her arms might tell a story they weren't qualified to understand. They made the oldest and most arrogant mistake in human history. They assumed that what they could see was all there was to see. Dr. Lucien Crowell believed that credentials equaled competence, that Instagram followers meant surgical skill, that a degree from an Ivy League school made him superior to someone who'd learned medicine in the dirt and blood of a battlefield, where mistakes didn't mean lawsuits, they meant body bags. He was wrong. In a world obsessed with status and ego, with titles and social media metrics and the performance of expertise, Alara Voss reminds us of something we've forgotten. True strength doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need validation or recognition or applause. It doesn't need to be seen. It just steps up when the fire starts. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for someone with the right credentials to take charge. It sees what needs to be done and does it, regardless of the cost, regardless of the consequences. Because that's what strength is. Not the absence of fear or pain or trauma, but the willingness to act despite it. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never dismiss the person who seems too old, too damaged, too broken to matter. Never assume that silence means weakness or that humility means incompetence, because the person mopping the floor might be the only one capable of saving your life. The person you're mocking in the break room might be the person who decides whether you live or die when everything falls apart. The person you've spent 3 weeks trying to force out might be the only one in the entire building who knows how to hold the line when the darkness comes. Alara Voss didn't need St. Jude's to validate her worth. She knew who she was. She'd always known. She just needed them to give her the space to be useful, to save lives, to feel like her hands could still do good in the world. They denied her that dignity. So she took it back, and in doing so, she reminded every person in that hospital, every doctor who'd laughed at her, every nurse who'd looked down on her, every administrator who'd seen her as a liability, that courage doesn't wear a white coat. That heroism doesn't need credentials. That sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone's been ignoring. The legend of Alara Voss Sentinel, Valkyrie, the nurse who was a soldier, would never leave St. Jude's Trauma Center. It would live in the way doctors spoke to new hires, in the way residents treated the support staff, in the photograph taped to an empty locker with one word written beneath it, asterisk, asterisk, respect, asterisk, asterisk, because some lessons can only be learned through fire, and Alara Voss had been forged in flames the rest of them couldn't imagine. She walked among them carrying ghosts they would never see and scars they would never understand. And when the moment came, when death walked through the doors of their pristine hospital with tactical gear and suppressed weapons, she stepped forward, not because she wanted to, not because she was seeking glory, but because it was what she'd always done, what she would always do. Save lives, hold the line, choose who lives and who dies. That's what Valkyries do. And the world is full of them walking quietly among us, unnoticed and underestimated, carrying the weight of battles we'll never know about, until the moment we need them. And then, if we're lucky, they step forward one more time,